when code became law. It didn't arrive with police or parliaments. It arrived with an update, a line of code deployed quietly, executing rules no human could interrupt once they went live. And in that moment, authority shifted not to a person but to software. Today, smart contracts govern billions of dollars, enforce agreements, and resolve outcomes without courts, signatures, or discretion. To understand why this matters now, we have to examine the moment when rules stopped being interpreted and started being executed automatically. Because when code became law, the meaning of justice, trust, and power changed forever. For most of history, laws relied on interpretation. Judges weighed context. Officials exercised judgment. Enforcement depended on institutions and human decision-making. This system was slow, imperfect, and often unfair, but allowed flexibility. Code offered something radically different: precision, finality, no exceptions. The reveal began with smart contracts, programs that execute exactly as written when conditions are met. No appeals, no delays, no discretion. If the code says funds move, they move. If the condition fails, nothing happens. At first, this felt like efficiency, automation without bureaucracy, agreements without middlemen. But something deeper was happening. These contracts didn't just automate transactions, they embedded values. Every assumption, every edge case, every limitation became permanent the moment the code was deployed. Intent mattered less than execution, and execution became absolute. Early adopters celebrated the clarity. No corruption, no favoritism, no interpretation, just rules enforced evenly across everyone. But critics saw a danger emerging. Laws evolve, code does not. And when mistakes exist in software, they don't ask permission before causing harm. What started as a technical breakthrough was quietly becoming a new legal layer, one that operated globally, instantly, and without human mercy. And once people trusted it with value, they trusted it with authority. The world had crossed an invisible line. Governance was no longer defined solely by institutions. It was being written directly into software, and that software was now deciding outcomes at scale. As smart contracts spread, their influence extended far beyond simple transactions. Entire financial systems began running on automated logic, executing complex strategies without pause or oversight. Lending protocols issued loans instantly. Liquidation engines enforced collateral rules with ruthless precision. Markets moved at machine speed, indifferent to circumstance or intent. What once required layers of legal enforcement now unfolded in seconds, governed by nothing but code. This efficiency came with an unsettling side effect. There was no room for compassion, no concept of fairness beyond what had been predefined. When conditions were met, actions triggered, regardless of consequences. A market crash could wipe out positions in moments. A minor bug could cascade into catastrophic losses. And once the code executed, there was no authority to appeal to. The conflict emerged when reality collided with rigidity. Users began asking difficult questions. What happens when the code behaves as designed, but the outcome is unjust? Who is responsible when automated systems cause harm? Is it the developer who wrote the contract, the user who interacted with it, or the network that executed it? These questions had no clear answers. Traditional legal systems were built around accountability, intent, and remedy. Smart contracts ignored all three. They didn't recognize context. They didn't understand nuance. They enforced rules with absolute indifference. In doing so, they exposed a gap between human values and machine logic that no one had fully anticipated. High-profile failures intensified the debate. Exploits drained millions from protocols without technically breaking any rules. The code functioned exactly as written, yet users suffered devastating losses. Developers insisted the system worked as designed. Victims argued that design without safeguards was negligence. Trust fractured in spaces that once celebrated automation as progress. At the same time, defenders pointed out something equally uncomfortable. Traditional systems failed constantly, too, through corruption, bias, and inefficiency. Code, for all its flaws, at least treated everyone the same. It did not discriminate. It did not take bribes. It executed impartially, even if that impartiality felt cold. This philosophical divide deepened as smart contracts expanded into new domains: governance, insurance, identity, even dispute resolution. Each new use case raised the stakes. Decisions once made by humans were now made by software, and once deployed, those decisions could not be undone without collective agreement, something rarely achieved in decentralized systems. The question was no longer whether code could enforce rules. It was whether society was ready for rules that could not bend, and what would cost to live under them. As automated systems grew more complex, the consequences of immutable rules became impossible to ignore. Smart contracts began interacting with other smart contracts, forming dense webs of dependency where a single flaw could ripple outward without warning. One assumption embedded deep in the code could trigger outcomes no human ever intended, and when that happened, there was no emergency brake. The conflict intensified when governance itself moved on-chain. Voting systems, treasury controls, and protocol upgrades were all encoded into rules executed automatically once thresholds were met. Power shifted from institutions to token holders, from interpretation to arithmetic. In theory, this was democracy perfected. In practice, it introduced new vulnerabilities: low participation, whale dominance, voters swayed by incentives rather than long-term consequences. Moments of crisis exposed the fragility of algorithmic governance. When attacks unfolded in real time, communities scrambled to coordinate responses, only to realize the code could not wait. Time locks expired, conditions triggered, funds moved. By the time consensus formed, the outcome was already locked in. The law had been executed before the courtroom could convene. These events forced an uncomfortable realization. Code did not replace law. It replaced discretion. And discretion was where humanity had always softened the edges of rigid rules. Without it, systems became brutally consistent, fair in theory, unforgiving in reality. Developers began experimenting with safeguards, emergency pauses, multi-signature controls, human-in-the-loop mechanisms designed to slow execution when anomalies appeared. But each safeguard reintroduced trust, the very thing automation was meant to remove. Every safety valve sparked the same debate. Was this protection, or was it control disguised as caution? Meanwhile, regulators observed from the sidelines, uncertain how to respond. Laws written for human actors struggled to apply to autonomous code. Courts could punish developers, but not networks. They could regulate companies, but not protocols with no headquarters. The concept of jurisdiction itself began to blur. Users felt the tension most acutely. They wanted the efficiency of automation without the terror of finality. They wanted trustless systems that still understood human error. They wanted rules that could enforce fairness without becoming blind to reality. But those desires often contradicted each other. As code continued to absorb roles once held by institutions, the question grew heavier. If rules are executed by software, who decides the values those rules enforce? And once encoded, who has the authority to change them? The age of interpretation was fading. In its place rose an age of execution, precise, unstoppable, and increasingly central to how power moved through the digital world. The turning point came when communities finally accepted a truth they had been circling for years. Code was never neutral. It carried the values, assumptions, and blind spots of the people who wrote it. When code became law, it didn't eliminate power. It relocated it, embedding authority into systems that operated beyond interruption. The climax revealed itself through contrast. Automated systems proved they could outperform institutions in speed, transparency, and consistency. They reduced corruption. They removed gatekeepers. They enforced rules evenly without bias or favoritism. And yet, in moments of crisis, their strength became their weakness. Precision turned into rigidity. Finality turned into fragility. The absence of discretion became impossible to ignore. Out of this tension, a new understanding emerged. Code was not a replacement for human judgment. It was a tool that demanded new forms of responsibility. Communities began designing hybrid systems, not fully trustless, not fully centralized. Governance models evolved to include layered decision-making. Execution slowed intentionally. not to weaken automation, but to humanize it. The resolution wasn't a rejection of smart contracts, but a maturation of how they were used. Law did not disappear. It adapted. Justice did not vanish. It migrated. The future wasn't ruled by code alone, nor by institutions alone, but by the uneasy balance between the two. What this era ultimately revealed was simple and unsettling. Every society is governed by rules. The only question is whether those rules are written in books, enforced by people, or embedded invisibly into machines that never sleep. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When